This is part of an international dialogue project on the history of ideas and their practical applications, sponsored primarily by Professor Torsten Hägerstrand and myself at the University of Lund in Sweden. Our aim is to allow our diverse national traditions to let their own lived experience express itself, rather than write textbooks from the archives. This afternoon, we're going to listen to our very first North American discussion in this dialogue series. It is chaired by Professor Marvin Mikesell at the University of Chicago, and the panelists are Professor Clyde Koln, University of Iowa, Professor Cotton Mather, University of Minnesota, Professor Preston James, Maxwell Professor Emeritus, Syracuse University, and Leslie Hawes, Professor Emeritus, University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Our focus will be on the influence of the environment of graduate school. What we've heard from various individuals in Europe, from Finland to Israel, is that the period of one's formative years, socialization within graduate school, has an enduring effect on one's subsequent career. We're looking forward to a lively discussion, and I'm sure this North American story will be of great inspiration to those in Europe who have already been thinking along these lines. Thank you.
Professors have always been inclined to talk about themselves and be interested in each other. But maybe there's a little more of that going on now than in the past, because we all know that the opportunities for growth are very limited and will be for a number of decades. And one consequence of that is we'd all like to think that we could improve the environment in which we work. And we're going to talk here about the influence of the environment of graduate school, try to remember our own experiences, and try to reflect a bit on what might be an ideal environment, or at least a tolerable environment, for intellectual creativity. There are several of us here, and we have a very interesting array of experience. My own background is having been a graduate student in two big state universities in California in the period just after the Second World War, where most of the people were veterans on the GI Bill, but I was a little too young to be in the Second World War, so I missed that. But had the interesting experience of being in graduate school with veterans who were in a hurry to make up for lost time, and here I was younger, trying to keep up with this older group of people. Now, that period, at least the time when I finished, was 1959, and I find that one of the persons whose experiences we can profit from is Jimmy James, who entered graduate school 9 years before I was born. So I think this gives us a very nice array of different experiences, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what it was like to be a graduate student back in that period.
Well, when I went to Clark University, where they had just set up the Graduate School of Geography in 1921, there was no program as such. Nobody knew exactly what a proper training in geography ought to be. So in a sense, I made my own program. I even decided what it is I was going to study. I remember that one of the people there at Clark told me I ought to go to Chicago if I would ever amount to anything, because the best department of geography at that time was the University of Chicago. The difficulty was that I would have had to take a lot of elementary courses that I'd never had, like economic geography. I'd have to do a lot of work before I could start the program, and at Clark I was all ready to start my doctoral dissertation. So naturally I gave up the opportunity to go to Chicago.
Were there several faculty there at the time?
Well, it was an exciting time in this sense. The members, the people who came to offer at least lectures and some seminars were people who came in from outside for, say, 2 or 3 weeks at a time. That is, a course for a graduate student is a series of these things. Most of the people that I was interested in working with had been working on the peace conference in Paris. They were the people who drew the maps on which the new boundaries were drawn. This is very important work and based on very accurate, detailed mapping. And I remember looking with great delight at the maps that Colonel Lawrence Martin presented to us, mostly boundaries of Hungary and Poland, the new countries of Europe. This is fascinating work.
So you had the advantage then of being in a department that was doing something of great public
That's
interest.
it.
And as a young student, you could sort of be drawn into that atmosphere. I wonder if others have had that experience of going to a department where there was a research program underway that they could be sort of brought into as an apprentice, or thinking of a different experience where you have to sort of find your way and cultivate your own interest independently. That would certainly be a difference.
Well, I think in the mid-30s, by that time, Professor James had learned how to take care of a department as a member of the Department of Geography staff at Michigan. And in those days, you remember it was the Depression days, and the government had begun to make monies available for field work. The TVA was in process, and we were often involved in field studies that had very practical uses. I don't know if that goes along with this kind of thing, but we did see the application of geography almost immediately to public policies.
Well, you should remember that it was not only the things you were mentioning, but don't forget the Michigan Land Economic
right.
Survey.
That was a bit earlier.
Yeah, well, that was earlier, but when I came on the scene, there was a great deal of diversity within the department. McMurray, of course, had been involved in that early Michigan study. I believe Davis also had a part in it. So that part of my training was by these fellows that developed that with Carl Sauer early in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to me, Marvin, that one of the big things between the pre-war II and the post-war II had to do with numbers and the relationships in the graduate school between professors and students. I noticed this at University of Wisconsin that there were really just 6 of us as graduate students before the war.
That's right.
And we had more than one professor per graduate student. There was a sort of an informal relationship as well as the academic formal relationship. Some of the professors had more of an input in both ways, formally and informally. And after the war, you had this mass influx, and there was a separation between graduate student in a very personal way and the professor, even though we were supposed to be in a more informal age.
Uh-huh.
And another thing that I thought was very important was that before the war, we usually had a foreign professor, and they were mostly European professors. For example, we had Leo Weibel, different tradition, and it meant informally that when you had a seminar, at the end of the seminar, it really didn't end. We went down to the Roman Inn where you had spaghetti and beer, and this seminar went on informally until they threw us out at 1 a.m. This was a very important difference.
I think the informality at Berkeley around 1930 was one of the attractive features. Thornthwaite, who helped steer me in the direction of Berkeley, said, by all means, stick around after seminars, because Sir will talk. And he did so, as long as his students would stay around and listen or talk with him. He talked off the cuff and, quite frankly, on subjects of interest in geography and about the actors, the people in geography.
Mm-hmm.
I think this tradition of talking that way informally, I believe it came from the Salisbury seminar at Chicago. I've always thought that. I went to Michigan, you see, after I got my degree, and I was one of the very few people in the Middle West who had never been to Chicago. But everybody else in the Michigan department had been to Chicago, and they were devoted to Salisbury and his seminar. So I picked up a lot of ideas. In fact, I got my training not directly from Chicago, but very closely, indirectly from it. And I certainly benefited by the Chicago ideas. One of the ideals was this business of having an informal discussion of geographical problems, particular problems of how you proceed on a field study, all of these things without any organization. It was simply a free-for-all discussion. And the students and the faculty participated in this without any separation. It was simply a tremendous experience for a young fellow.
Jimmy, wasn't it true that in the time you were a graduate student, you had the Salisbury tradition, which you're talking about, but involved with that was the fact that physiography was important. And that meant that you were in the field and you had informal relationships. And we've gone through vogues as every field has gone through. We've gone through the vogue of the aerial photo, and this is not to say it isn't a very important tool, and the computer. But there's not very much in personal relationships of the kind that you're talking about, and being in direct contact with the field if you have the vogue of the computer. But in the Salisbury days, you went out and looked at the subject. We rarely look at the subject today.
That's right.
We talk about it a lot, but we looked at it. And a stuffed shirt in the field is exposed very suddenly.
I wanted to add that variation at Michigan when I was there in the mid-30s or late 30s, is that we were out in the field every Wednesday afternoon, all day Saturday, and every summer.
Every summer, yes.
Every
You had these
summer.
summer field
Uh-huh.
camps that used to
And
be
many of these discussions, these seminars, didn't go on in a seminar room, but took place in the field.
Mhm.
And of course, Jimmy is part responsible for that in the development or participation in that spring conference or field studies. And as graduate students, we all yearned to be with him in that field to find out. And I remember Joe Russell was asked once to go, and we all envied him as graduate students.
But let me just put another point in here that I have, as an historian of geography, I'm beginning to get into the archives, and I'm finding out all kinds of things that I didn't experience directly. But one of them is that there's a wholly new, different tradition in the development of geographical ideas, which comes from economics rather than geology. Now, anybody trained in geology who became a geographer was devoted to field study. But anybody trained in economics, he never did any field study. These fellows emphasized theoretical models, the construction of theoretical models, the use of statistical procedures, and these things were introduced to geography from the economists. Richard T. Eby is the one that I think of as a person who was primarily responsible, maybe indirectly, but nevertheless a direct relationship to the development of geographical ideas among the economists. And of course, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania was where economic geography really originated. And these fellows never did any field work.
Except that now, in training them to think in terms of models and deductive methods, we do ask them to go out and affirm their deductions in the field, that is, test what they have deduced to see if it bears up when they're out in the field.
But,
Or at least you collect data from interviews,
Yes.
which then analyze.
or more usually, you don't collect data and you don't do field work. You go out, you write an article, for example, in research, and then you go out and take 3 photographs to prove that you were there and the research was well done. There's a difference before you actually went out and did field research.
That's right.
And today, most of the research by students and faculty alike has varied somewhat from that, wouldn't you say?
Well, they
Jim?
get that data from census data.
Well, and I'm going to object to this a bit, because with the
You
swing...
come from a business school.
No, with the swing to behavioral studies, I think we're doing much more many hours in the field or with subjects now than we did in the 1960s and early 70s when economic geography was more in the forefront.
The field course at Berkeley was a strong point. I think I took that course either formally or informally each time it was offered when I was there, and I think we all profited from it.
What did you do in the field? I'm sort of curious.
Oh,
Did
we
you
made-
run around with soil augers and act like scientists, or did you try to get at the job?
We did a bit of that. It was more commonly we went out and to see what we could see.
Did you make maps?
We did a few times. More often, I think not. But there were some maps made. Yes.
Incidentally, that's another point of the 30s that has lived with me ever since, is the emphasis on cartography, on maps and mapping in the field at Michigan got us into and made us really work at it.
But that emphasis on making the map yourself began to go out in the 30s because of the use of air photographs.
Yes.
That is, vertical air photographs became the basis on which you actually
that's
plotted the data.
Yes, that when you see, I was in my field camps were in the late 50s,
Yeah.
and in fact we went out with overlays and marked on vertical photographs.
Yeah.
That
Well,
was
I
what we
came
were
in
doing.
between, and I can tell you a good little story on that. Trewartha was my field instructor, and he was having us go out with plane tables. Well, now plane tables were already out of date,
Oh, yes.
but Trewartha knew what he was doing, because he wasn't going to go around and plane table everything we did in order to check on us. He was using their photo.
Yeah.
But you see, I didn't know that. And I was out in the field with John Borchert and Wilbur Zelensky in one team. And after about 30 minutes, I thought, this is the real baloney, running up and down this ground moraine and with a plane table. And so I just went up and sat under a tree.
And incidentally,
Soon-
that must have been quite a team that you were on.
That was. And then pretty soon Borchert came up and said, well, what about this? I said, you fellas can go on if you want to. I'm going to do it the easy way. Zelensky was still going around over the ground moraine. Well, anyway, we made our maps for the whole term in about 1 hour later with an air photo. Borchert gave Trewartha gave Borchert and Mather A's and gave Zelensky a B. I got qualms of conscience first and last time, I guess, but I went in to see Trewartha, and he said, well, this is the way I checked it. He said, it's okay. That's the way it should be done. But you see, we went through this period of where you used methods that were necessary. Then when these new things came in, we had a bunch of archaic professors leading us around for a long time, and there were a lot of us got sickened on this, and we said we didn't want anything to do with field work again. And I really am serious about this, that when I see today field camps where people that don't know a soil from a rock are carrying a soil auger and acting like this is what it's all about, I think we have to ask questions. I'm for field work, Jimmy, like you did.
And
but
like you did
adjusting it to
in the
present
sand
period.
hills.
Yeah.
You know, it can be
I'll bet there.
structured. I can give you an example I think is very interesting. I regret to say at Chicago we gave up our field camp through just simply because we didn't have a single member of the faculty who wanted to do it. But in the last years, 1 year out in northern Indiana, we had an interesting experience. We sent the students out one day and said, you can only observe. You're forbidden to talk to anyone. You can't ask any questions. You can't read anything. And we had a discussion that evening on what was seen. And it was fascinating because people saw different things. We had a foreign student who said these little towns have such incredible shade trees. We had others who said, notice the transportation facilities and so on. And we had built up a kind of discussion of the morphology of these towns based upon observation. And that was the first day. And the feeling was, well, you know, description really isn't all that easy. But then all the questions started coming up about function, about trade hinterlands, of all the things that observation couldn't observe. So they went back a second day to interview. And then they were after these functional, in a sense, making it a nodal region by finding out where the customers came from and where people went on their Sunday trips and so on. Came back at another discussion, which was on interviewing. We still had additional questions, and the third day they went back and looked into the historical record to get in the background. And I don't know that anyone has attempted to sort of break it this way. Of course, normally when you go out in the field, all this is happening at once. You're looking, you're interviewing, you probably read something, and it's all put in.
Who was in
But-
charge of your field?
Well, this particular field trip I was in charge of. And I was thinking in terms of trying to separate this. Now, I've never done it again, and it may be that from the educational point of view, this was unwise to artificially break it this way, because normally all the things are going on at once.
That does bring to mind a discussion we used to have at Michigan at that time, is whether or not you went out into the field with a problem, or whether you went out in the field and found the problem in the area in which you were interested. And there were several of the faculty who believed strongly in the second part, that you went out to observe the area and you discovered the problems through observations.
Yes, I've heard that. I think another issue, too, is looking at departments, whether the primary purpose is to teach or encourage awareness of ideas or methods. Now, I think in my years at Berkeley, it would be very clear, at least insofar as Sauer is concerned, that he was throwing out ideas. And he was giving people a sense of problem. And you were on your own to find the method to solve the problem.
Well,
Often
that's
going
just
into other departments, taking courses outside. Now, many departments are the reverse, where they're really teaching method, and you're on your own to find the problem. And that's a big difference right
But
there.
the Michigan group was strong on this business of going out and discovering your problem. And when the year after I went to Michigan in 1924, I went to Trinidad to make a study of the island, of the land use on the island of Trinidad. And I came up with, I think, what would be reasonably called today a theoretical model. That is, a new crop like sugarcane, for instance, would originate. The first a place where it concentrated, it would be right near the largest city, Port of Spain. Then the crop would spread all over the island, and then retreat eventually to the best suited places, physically best suited places. Now, that idea actually came from O.E. Baker. O.E. Baker used to teach that kind of a thing. And only recently do I realize that it was actually, O.E. Baker got it from the teaching of Richard T. Ely. Now, this was the economic input into geographical work.
Land economics, yeah.
Land economics, yes.
See, Jimmy, what you're talking about is the educational experience as we think of it formally and what it really is. 40 years after you've been a graduate student, you look back and you find that one of the most important things in graduate school are the things that weren't in the formal structure. It, for example, is like Wisconsin when V.C. Finch wanted me to drive the automobile on weekends going out, and I was sitting in private with him and listening to a seasoned geographer in the field. It was like, for example, with Leo Weibel, a German geographer who had done settlement studies in Africa, South America, Costa Rica, and you go out on a vacation with him. And I never noticed a snow fence. He photographed every snow fence. He was so impressed by these. And he introduced me to the difference between Polish farmsteads and German farmsteads. He sensitized me. He taught me more than I'd ever learned in the classroom. The point I'm making is this, that it was the classroom or the formal course that introduced me to the professor. And the professor then, in the informal ways, by being introduced to me, gave me an opportunity to come together. Now, I'd like to elaborate just a little bit that we had World War II when we assembled in Washington. That's when I met most of the people here at this table, probably. And I'll end this little point with this remark, that you were one of my professors, one of my 4 outstanding professors. I never would have met you, Jimmy, if it hadn't been for World War II. But it was the fact that I had been introduced into the academic enterprise then, and I knew Dick Hartshorn, and through him, you, and this is the way life rolls.
Well, I mean, if you have some kind of a practical problem that is thrust upon you, like a war situation, this is enormously beneficial for anybody who is not quite sure what kind of a problem they want to work on. I suppose really there are 2 professional fields that do in fact benefit from a war. One is medicine, the other is geography. And this happened again and again in my own experience, that this is because people realize the need for the kinds of things that geographers work on.
But also, there's just the question of people getting together.
Yeah.
That is,
Yeah,
you're
yes.
meeting different people, and you then have this environment for this human environment that occurs as you met together in Washington. But you also had your national organization that could bring you together, and so on. I wonder if we could think a little bit about the question of change, there's always a danger, and I'm even almost fearful to introduce this because mostly what we're talking about is informality, a rather intimate situation when you're out with your professor, and it's difficult not to be nostalgic when one thinks about that. We know that after the Second World War there was tremendous growth, everything got larger, more impersonal, and we don't want to just say, well, you know, the good old days, it was smaller scale and we knew each other better and so on, but still we have to come to grips with the way things are now or how they've evolved, say, over the last 20 years or so. And if we still have a good environment for creative activity, comparable to what we've just been recalling, and if we don't have it, then how could we get it again, or what steps might be
I
taken?
thought Cotton was going into that a few minutes ago when he was talking about some of the things that were taking place now. There's one thing that was true of Michigan, and I hope it's true of departments I'm associated with, and to me makes the difference between a good and a not so good department, and that's the openness of communication. The communication between faculty members working on research and sharing that research, the working between faculty and students, graduate and undergraduate students, so that they know the research the professor is doing. They're stimulated that way, working with the professor and sharing it, and graduate students themselves sharing what they're doing with the professors and with each other, so that there's a complete openness to communication. And I think that's one thing I found at Michigan when I was there. We had 6 professors, all of whom were different and even had different foci to their research, and yet they worked together, or seemingly did, and they worked with us as graduate students, and we were stimulated as a result. And I see that going on in many institutions yet today, and I thought maybe you were getting at that, Cotton, a bit ago.
Yes. I think actually the apprenticeship relation is the most important in graduate study. Now, we in this country take great pride that we're modern and bringing in new things, and the implication is that new things are better. As I see graduate study, it has changed, but it has changed less than any other level of education. So we could say it is the most unchanging or stable, or according to American evaluation, probably needs more changing. But I think it's the one part that has been saved the most from the standpoint of apprenticeship learning. And this is what graduate study is all about. You cannot learn to write just by reading. You cannot learn to swim by being lectured at. Eventually you're going to have to jump in the water. And this is what we have to do in geography, is to have a working relationship with a master. And of course this, when you're talking about graduate school and recollecting the old days, I'm trying to forget a lot of the old days because there's some profs that were not working geographers. Right. I don't want to remember them. I don't think of it as the good old days.
Or unpleasant working relationships.
That's right. But there were old masters, and there are people today who are masters. But they belong to the 2% club, don't they, Jim?
It's an interesting thing that some of the younger generation right now who actually come out with a statement that the most exciting period in intellectual development in geography in the United States was in the 60s and 70s. And this was a great period of intellectual change and so on. If these fellows could have lived through the period of the 20s, when the first introduction of theoretical models took place, when the theoretical model was not only described and explained in one place, but then was tested. Mm-hmm. That model I told you about in Trinidad, I went back to Trinidad in the 1950s and tested this to see how many of my predictions were coming right. As a matter of fact, certain were and some of them weren't.
But Jimmy, you're not going to condemn each generation because I think it's the exciting part.
Yeah, I was going to say that doesn't there have to be a kind of autobiographical tone to this, that the exciting new geography, of course, is the geography you learn when you are a graduate student. And also there's a difficulty not to have a feeling of nostalgia or to personalize. I want to pick up on something Clyde said I thought was very important. I was groping with the idea of change of scale. I mean, after we know that the geographical profession now has about 10,000 members in North America, and you're talking about an enormously smaller enterprise.
Oh, yeah.
You talked about smaller departments, and Clyde, I do believe you said that, well, you know, one can still have that, but your department is small. That is, you have, what, 6 or 7?
Well, we have 10 faculty
10,
members
and how
about
many,
40,
about 40 students.
45
So see that,
graduate
in
students.
your case, you've been
Very
able to maintain approximately the same kind of relationship. I know at Berkeley, when I went there were 6 faculty and about 15 students. Now, I think one of the issues that perhaps Cotton could address, and I'm sure Les would be aware of this, what happens when it becomes just a quantum leap, that you're in a department that has 40 people, and you've got 200 majors, and you're in a great big place, in a new building where all you are, you're the 5th floor of a new building and so on. And I'm thinking particularly of this post-World War II kind of explosion, and to what extent did this intimate apprenticeship relationship that we talked about, what were the stresses on it that came out there?
Well, the seminars are listed as seminars. They were listed as seminars before. Before you had discussion, you had maybe 6 people around a table. You went in a car out in the field. You had discussion. You had personal relationships. Today you have a seminar, and if the professor is really a professor that has something to say, the students get the message, and you've got 47 people in there. Now, what sort of thing is this? It's listed as a seminar, and it's not a seminar. But I'd like to make a positive note on this, and that is that when we were students, for example, in the Midwest, most of the students were Midwest. One of the big revolutions is mobility of people. You sit today in a classroom, you've got somebody from China there, you've got somebody from the Balkans, you've got Latin Americans. Another thing is you've got Americans, Midwesterners, who have been elsewhere. And when you have seminars, they have Kodachrome slides. They show what they're talking about. They may not know, Jimmy, what we thought of as field work, but at least they were there, they photographed it, and you can't get by with some of the stuff you old boys got by in the old days.
And incidentally, I'd just like to put in one thing going back to what you were talking about in using old methods of training, like using the plane table, for instance, to teach them elements of mapping. Remember, the geographers are not alone in this. You know what they do in the Naval Academy? The second-year men have a cruise on a square rigger.
Oh, yes.
Now, of all the ridiculous things in the world for a person who's going to run a submarine, these fellows learn all about the ropes on square rigger. I don't believe
That's
this
their
is really
counterpart
true
of our
anymore.
plane table.
I don't think that's true anymore. But it wasn't so long ago that they did this. And they took great pride in running that square rigger around. It's the same thing as running a plane table.
Yes.
I never was a member of a big department as a graduate student or as an instructor either. But at Berkeley, under Sauer, we profited from some cross-fertilization. He is a great baseball fan, likened himself, Kroeber in anthropology and Bolton in history, to the double play combination of Tinker to Everest to Chance. And we took work elsewhere, and I think profited from it.
You know what team it was that had those people?
Well, one of the Chicago teams.
No, it wasn't.
Wasn't?
The Boston Braves.
My mistake.
See, Les, and that brings up that in the old days you took minor work in other disciplines. As we have grown large today, we have minor work in the department.
True.
And so, as our perspectives in the modern world have supposedly gotten broader and broader, in one sense, we become more ingrown, at least in that sense, that the discipline has been cloistered more today unto itself. Don't you think that's true?
Well, not necessarily,
Well, do you
because
think-
there are some areas, like I can think of the area of urban and the area of energy and so on, where it's a broadening experience. The research and the teaching cross-fertilizing with, in our case, law and engineering and geography in engineering.
Yes,
or
but
in energy.
you're a small
And,
department at Iowa. I'm talking about the massive type of department we have at Minnesota, where the faculty are on 3 floors. The students are here, there, and everywhere.
Right.
We set up programs that we think are just marvelous. And that is because we have so much specialization in this branch of geography, in this branch, in this branch, that we are cutting out the outside geography experience. And Clyde, you know very
Yeah,
well
that-
that you've got an interesting argument, but it's only interesting if you don't look at it too far, in that, for example, in the old days, we had 2 foreign languages.
Yes.
And Iowa
It's
is
gone.
one of the traitors to this kind of
Right.
thing.
It's gone.
Do you even have 1 foreign language?
No.
Okay, so this is another
calculus
illustration
now.
of how, in the old days at least, you went and had some contact with the French or the
Yes.
German and so forth. And I think this is a fascinating thing, that we think that today we're getting broader and broader, and we're covering more physical space, 3 floors of professors at Minnesota, but more ingrown in a way.
Or with sub-departments, because
With
often,
sub-departments.
I think I've myself said, and I do believe that often now geography seems not even to be a noun, but it's some kind of suffix defined by adjectives. So the great big department that looks so impressive with 30 or 40 people may in fact be about 10 sub-departments, each one of which has only 2 people. And
Yes.
then you get into the interesting position that the big department may have only 2 people in the sub-field that you're committed. Then it's in fact smaller than a Berkeley of the 30s or a Clark even of the 20s. There's that problem. I wonder if we could think about an issue that is obviously important, rather difficult to handle, and that is the administrative style. And particularly as we think about the departments before the Second World War, mostly we're talking about a situation where you had the old-style permanent head, who probably had been in the job for a decade or more and might very well have been the chairman or the head of the department for most of his mature years. Now, of course, as we look around the country, you have rotating chairmanships, sometimes 3 years. I know of cases even 2-year rotations, and rarely more than about 6 years. So there's obviously here a very different situation in the human environment. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit that would it be fair to say that most of us started in an authoritarian atmosphere, a kind of patriarchy, which we talk about in such a friendly way that we must have enjoyed it, and we're now, in many cases, I think, close to something that could almost be called anarchy, or a kind of rotating egalitarian situation. Now, how do we feel about that? As Americans, we would naturally tend to think that the new situation is closer to our spirit than this almost feudalistic pattern, and yet I sense from the rather warm way that the past has been talked about that there might be ambivalence on this issue.
Well, I would certainly agree that the long-term job of a department chairman is much better. These short-term jobs are simply the head of the department becomes simply a sort of an office boy to
That's
see
right.
that the chalk is put around and the rooms are assigned. He does the tasks that are sort of routine that ought to be done by an administrative assistant. But to actually keep a group of scholars happy together is a full-time job. I mean, this is not something you can do on certain hours of the day. You do it all the time. And it's a very important job because scholars are peculiar people. I suppose that everybody's peculiar, but scholars have certain elements of peculiarity. And it's not easy to keep these fellows talking to each other and avoid the kind of antagonisms that sometimes develop and split departments right down the middle.
Of course.
There's
It takes
also
time to do that.
There's also the working relations with the rest of the university, with your administrative officers, with your fellow chairmen in other departments. I'm worried. You use the word anarchy, and I sometimes really think that is what we're heading for in terms of the turnover, the rotation of chairmanships.
And with the turnover, we had the fact that for the head really administered the department. The budgets were pretty much secret. You weren't diverted from your professional motivation. And the minute you open it up to democracy, everybody's fighting about everybody else's $50 salary. Then on top of that, today you have the big bureaucracy above the department, and they are going to ask questions for the computer for all of us. And we have to put out as the most important thing, how much in grants did you get this past year? And people get advancement by grantsmanship, not by scholarship. Now, sometimes these overlap accidentally, but sometimes they don't. And so what we've really done, I think, is when we changed from what we're talking about a chairmanship to the rotating situation, is a whole complex of factors that have made it very difficult for a person to go full-time without being on 77 committees, applying for grants, getting mixed up with the federal government, waving around a lot of equipment, worshiping science as a great deity.
I think it also sets a different environment for the graduate student.
Oh, sure.
That they can't depend on what's going to happen before they finish their graduate work in terms of departmental policies,
Considerable
programs,
continuity.
and continuity
formally.
there.
But there is, it seems to me, there's an answer to that, and I've heard this question raised very often. What happens when you're in a department and you have the different atmosphere of the students who are assistants on projects and the mavericks who are not? And you can have a serious morale problem, particularly if the former group is well paid and the latter is difference of standard of living. You can almost physically see the difference. But I think one way of solving that problem is to be sure that your projects are related to your educational program and that the departments do not become, in effect, branches of the government. And I think a certain amount of real concern about taking on work that is intellectually compatible with the discipline and its orientation would resolve that problem. Because certainly none of us would be at all offended if the work we would do would be useful to someone. We don't have a feeling of refusal to do that. That is another aspect of the problem that we've been thinking about. I suppose it's inconceivable that we'd ever have a class of professional managers of geography, like hospital administrators or...
I hope not.
But we do have a managerial class in geography. There are people who are full-time managers. But mostly we haven't got that far, that you're pretty sure the people you're dealing with are professionals in this field. And I guess geography just isn't big enough to have a professional managerial
I'd like to
grouping.
know what's happened in, say, departments of economics around the country. Do they have this problem?
Well, I think you may find 2 or 3 administrative assistants who are doing various
Well,
things.
administrative assistant is fine, as long as you have somebody up over him. who
No,
can
I know
set
there is a
policy.
field called hospital administration,
I know
where
that.
people are not doctors, but they have a career sort of running things.
Right.
And I think that, particularly in the 60s, this glorious period of the 60s, which was the sort of post-Putnik panic period, with a lot of money spent on reform of science and engineering, and whole different styles of life were started during that period, expecting grants, having a large infrastructure of administration, federal support, and so on. I think we're moving away from that now. And in many ways, the atmosphere we're in the late 70s going into the 80s is like the 30s. I'll tell you why I think this is true, because I've often had students come to me and say they want advice on employment, about various things they were doing. And I would have to say, well, you know, I was a teaching assistant in a state university, and I did my field work abroad on a grant from the Ford Foundation when there was lots of money for foreign area studies because it was thought Americans should have this. And if you just go to the next office, you're going to find someone who had his education on veterans benefits. And if you want to sort of get someone who can give you advice about the very austere situation today, you've got to go to the guy who was a student before the Second World War. And then he's going to tell you what it was like to come in as during your vacations and pursue your study when you were a high school teacher during your vacations, to work part-time and so on. So we have a difficulty, at least I find, in advising our own students because our personal experience, at least in my case, I feel guilty and uneasy about this. I feel that I was so spoiled and trying to deal with the people who are now in a tight market for jobs and nothing like the support we had makes it very different.
The student, the graduate student, usually has a propensity for eating and occasionally having beer. And what I was wondering, you knew the graduate school at the time of the Depression, didn't you?
Yes.
And you've known it all the time since. And students make applications to graduate schools and they have to think, and I suppose they still think about the economics. See, we tend to think about the academic hall. I'd like to have you comment on what you think about this aspect of it. And Marvin was mentioning that jobs are hard to get now. Jobs weren't really in surfeit in the 30s, were they
no,
either?
goodness no.
Okay.
The economic factor certainly was an important one, and no doubt still is for a good many of these students. I was a teaching fellow, which would amount to a teaching assistant at Berkeley, and got a modest salary, about enough to live on. I think the chief benefit, though, was the work I did. We teaching fellows attended the lectures in the beginning courses and learned a lot from it. In fact, I've told some graduate students who complained about their stipends at Nebraska, well, you ought to pay us for the experience you're getting. But of course, that wouldn't take care of the beans and the corn,
Or live on tips.
cornmeal and so on.
Well, what do you think the situation is today compared to the 30s?
Oh, the salaries are much higher.
Yes, but so is the cost of living.
That's true. That's true. I suppose rather comparable, really, in those terms.
Mhm.
And some, quite a few today, to be sure, do have teaching assistantships.
The change I see is that the cost of living's gone up, the stipend's gone up. What has changed is that in the old days, you got the stipend from the university. When you went as a graduate school, or graduate student to the department, this was a guaranteed sum
Yes.
from your local institution based on your scholarship application. And today, when the graduate students come in, they get a guarantee like they did in the old days, but as soon as they get there, they find that certain professors have grants with foundations, federal government, and there is the possibility that academically their decisions might be tempered by the fact that there are, for a graduate student, some rather fat little assistantships or additional remunerations
Research
that are put into the
assistantships.
system. And I guess what I'm saying is that I think that professors have this danger today from the standpoint of carrying on their academic enterprise, and we have now introduced the students as in the training process what this all means so that they too can face this kind of diversion for remuneration, or they can try to keep themselves intellectually independent. And I see this as a major change between the old days and the new days.
It's interesting that works at even another level. I once saw an editorial in a biology magazine where a very angry biology student said, "Why don't you biology professors practice zero population growth for your own profession and quit enticing us into a field for which the opportunities are very limited?" It's a very angry letter. And then about a month later, I saw a very thoughtful editorial by an historian who said, "Give them the facts, be honest with them, but let them make the choice. You know, they have a right to be an astronomer or to try to be an astronomer, even if there are only 3 or 4 openings a year." And we're all caught in that, and geography is just limited enough that we're in this state of worrying about this. And my own feeling is that we should give the best possible information on what the prospects are. and then let them make the choice and welcome them if they want to, try to be a geographer. But we also have to get out and beat the bushes and cultivate our placement office and be aware of the many things one can do with geography other than teach. And above all, be aware that it's a good general foundation for almost anything you want to do, and we can really sell it on that basis. In the little time we have remaining, I wish each of you would try to reflect a little bit on what you think would be an ideal environment. I know it's hard to speculate because often it's the very environment we had and remembered that is the good one. But what would be Camelot? Even, what would be the size of it? How many professors we have and what students? Would it be all seminars? Would it be some kind of field course everyone would take? Or would it be a more individualistic venture? Suppose you were chairman of a brand new department with no constraints whatsoever, could choose the best faculty and the best students and have all the money you want and so on. What would be even one or two ideas that you think would go into the blueprint of making an ideal department?
I think I'd start with that one that you just mentioned, the best faculty you get together. Because I don't think you're going to be successful unless you have men who and women out in forefront in their profession, that are making contributions, that are excited by the discipline themselves, and are leading that. So
About how many?
Well, we think we're too small.
With about 10.
That was 10. I've always thought that you need some diversity. I don't want to have so much diversity then you become small within the large, as you mentioned earlier. I think there's some kind of a critical threshold here of the number in a given area of research. We're trying to think that through with the problem of regional development, and we've got 3 that are working in that area, and there's a great deal of cross-fertilization.
That's the cluster idea that's so fashionable now, of having complementary relationships as against having this sort of kind of basic array of, say, the physical, the cultural, historical, the urban economic as a nucleus. How do you feel about being a general or pluralistic department or one with a specialized thrust?
No,
what kind would you
like
like?
to see us go more pluralistic than we have been able to at Iowa.
You would.
Having 4 or 5 of those clusters so that you draw students with different interests and you have different interests within the faculty itself.
I would react to that, Clyde, when you said you'd like the best faculty by saying the best faculty for what?
Well,
I think that in the field, we need technicians and we need educated people. And most of our specialisms, as they've evolved in the last 2 decades, are really concerned with vocational training.
Yeah.
Now, since things are changing very fast, even technologically and almost every other way in the world today, it seems to me that while the tradition in the old days was to be educated, the imperative today is much more for education. And so when you say the best faculty, I would say for what? And the answer is
content.
To educate people, not to train them. Now, I'm not against training, but I think if some departments want to have vocational training, we ought to label them as such. A PhD in most of our geography graduate schools is not an educational experience, it's a training experience. And this is the thing that I feel that is so important in this kind of discussion. And I think it should be open to different departments to go different ways, because we need different people, and some people are not as easily educatable as others.
I think you're introducing a second of an ideal department. What are the experiences you would provide for the graduate students, providing you had a competent faculty to provide those?
Well, we were talking about this at lunch. I said one of the great things was going to national meetings by a railway train. Now, you don't put this in the catalog, you don't put this in your course curriculum, but in the old days, a few graduate students, and there are only a few that are going to be people that'll become scholars anyway, so I'm not upset about this, but a few graduate students in the old days got on the train, they were with their professors, they rode from a place like Minneapolis down to Madison, a few more professors and a few more graduate students got on, and the train rolled on to Chicago. And this is the kind of thing that happens in life. The train rolls on, and people get on and off the train. And some professors retire on full salary at age 32. And others continue like Jimmy, approaching, what is it, about 50?
I'm going on 90.
Not going on 90, 1 year near every year. But you see, this is the way it is, and you had those experiences that are very difficult to lay out in a program, so that when Marvin asks, how do you do this, I think it goes to the individual professor, and this kind of thing that Sauer did, that he created an atmosphere. Did he require, now everybody here has to go to Baja, California?
No, he didn't
No.
do that, and I think
It is a
less-
privilege.
A privilege.
But you see there, that's at the issue. I didn't say let's have a blueprint, or I just said one or two ideas that would enter into this ideal, because we're dealing with a very delicate question that I think can never be answered, and that's morale. There's no doubt that Sauer's department at Berkeley had high morale, and I would defy anyone to write on paper exactly what it was. I think, this is my own view, that the reason why the morale was so high is Sauer managed to convince most of the students that the work they were doing was extremely important. Not only that, but he was waiting for them, that he was sort of impatiently waiting for you to come in with your results, because he would just snatch it out of your typewriter the moment you'd written it. He was so eager to get it. And the effect of that was just sky-high morale, because we knew he was a brilliant person, and he led us to believe what we were doing was part of this intellectual enterprise. And literally, people, went into the jungles, climbed walls, because they had this sense of spirit. Now, that's something very personal. It worked very well there. There are certainly cases where people have gone to other institutions and tried to act just like him and couldn't carry it off. It
But
didn't work out.
That's a very important thing. If you have a good professor, that is somebody with imagination and so on, and with personality, you can see if you can't get him supported in some way to undertake a particular kind of field study. I tell you, back in the old days, I went out to Jackson Hole and made a study there, and associated with me were, I think, something like 5 or 6 graduate students, and they became some of the leading people in the profession later. These fellows combed Jackson Hole, made the maps of this area. I just noticed that recently President Carter came back from a vacation in Idaho through Jackson Hole,
Right.
and he made a speech there saying to the people who were trying to keep their homes, you see, away from the game refuges, they said, I will see to it you don't lose your home. That was exactly what was happening in 1935, the same thing. The paper I wrote on this, incidentally, was republished for the Wyoming legislature, because to tell the legislators of that state what the problem might be in Jackson Hole. And the point is that there was a practical problem in which the students were involved, which the faculty was involved, and it was an exciting experience. Now, that's something you can't always plan in advance. You have to take advantage of what comes along.
Well, that would be, you see, ideal if there would be this collective involvement with a effort. I had thought, particularly now as we're getting to the end of our discussion, that we could think of two terrible extremes. A graduate department that is so concerned only with technique that in effect it's producing hired guns who are ready to sort of do what anybody tells them to do and who get their intellectual initiative by orders. The opposite extreme would be very concerned, sensitive, intelligent people who would love to do something but don't know how to do it, who are sitting around helplessly. And somewhere in between is that real world that we struggle with. And as we have been able to demonstrate, I think, in our discussion, we've seen change from the 20s to the present time as the discipline itself has grown. We have had a variety of circumstances. We've had specialized departments, general departments of different size and character. And in this process of trial and error, it seems to me that we haven't got the ideal situation. And yet it's never been so miserable or unhappy that any of us has wanted to leave it.
Is it
So
really-
basically, there is this sense of sort of dissatisfied contentment that is our lot, and that, I think that's a pretty good reflection of how most professors feel about their life.